I woke up that Tuesday morning in September to find my neighbor, Patricia Henderson, standing at my fence with her phone pointed at my backyard compost bin like she just discovered a crime scene. I'd been living in Meadowbrook Heights subdivision in Charlotte, North Carolina for 3 years now, and in that time, Patricia had made it her personal mission to find something wrong with every single property on Willow Street. She was the vice president of our homeowner association, a position she wielded like a weapon, and at 52 years old, she had the energy of someone half her age when it came to finding violations. Her highlighted blonde hair was always perfectly styled, and she wore the kind of athletic wear that screamed, "I need to speak to your manager," even when she was just checking her mailbox. I opened my kitchen window. "Morning, Patricia. Can I help you with something?" She didn't lower her phone. "Richard Vance, I'm documenting a serious violation. Your compost pile is emitting steam which constitutes a fire hazard and a potential environmental concern." I nearly laughed. "It's compost. It's supposed to do that. It means the decomposition process is working correctly." "I don't care what it's supposed to do. The HOA bylaws clearly state that no resident shall create conditions that pose a risk to neighboring properties. I'm calling the police. The police. For compost steam." But she was already walking away, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice rising in that particular pitch that meant she was about to make someone's day miserable. I stood there in my kitchen, coffee mug in hand, wondering how my Tuesday had gone sideways before 8 in the morning. I'd started composting 6 months ago after attending a sustainable gardening workshop at the Charlotte Nature Museum. The instructor, an older gentleman named Mr. Chen, had explained how composting could transform vegetable scraps, grass clippings, and yard waste into nutrient-rich soil amendment. He'd been passionate about it, explaining the carbon to nitrogen ratios, the importance of turning the pile, and yes, the steam that would rise from a properly maintained hot compost system. My bin sat in the back corner of my yard, a 3-sided wooden structure about 4 feet on each side. I'd built it myself using untreated lumber and chicken wire, following plans I'd found online. Inside were layers of kitchen scraps, shredded newspaper, grass clippings, and dead leaves. The pile heated up naturally as billions of microorganisms broke down the organic matter, sometimes reaching temperatures of 130 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. On cool mornings like this one, with the temperature in the low 60s, that heat created visible steam rising from the pile. It was perfectly normal. It was actually a sign I was doing everything right. I finished my coffee and headed outside to check on the bin before I had to leave for work. I was a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing firm downtown, and I had a 9 o'clock meeting I couldn't miss. The compost looked exactly as it should, dark and earthy, with that rich smell of decomposition that somehow wasn't unpleasant when done correctly. I turned it 2 days ago, mixing the outer material into the center to ensure even breakdown. The steam rose in lazy wisps, catching the morning sunlight. I heard the sirens about 20 minutes later. I was inside, gathering my laptop bag and keys when I saw the police cruiser pull up in front of my house. Patricia stood on her lawn, arms crossed, looking vindicated. A tall officer stepped out of the car, adjusted his duty belt, and started walking up my driveway. I met him at the front door. He looked to be in his early 40s, with graying temples and tired eyes that suggested he'd already dealt with too much nonsense today. "Morning, sir. I'm Officer Dale Morrison. We received a call about a possible fire hazard. It's my compost bin. It's steaming because it's working properly." His expression shifted from official concern to something that looked like suppressed amusement. "Compost? Yes, sir. Would you like to see it? We walked around to the backyard. Patricia had apparently called her friend Susan, another HOA board member, because now there were two middle-aged women standing at my fence line, watching us like hawks. Officer Morrison approached the compost bin, observed the steam rising from it, and then did something unexpected. He leaned closer and inhaled. "That's a nice hot pile you've got there. What's your carbon to nitrogen ratio?" I blinked. "I aim for about 30 to 1. Mostly browns with regular additions of greens. You compost?" "Used to when I lived in my old place. Had a quarter-acre and 3 bins going. Rotated them seasonally." He walked around the structure, examining it professionally. "You built this yourself?" "Yeah, followed some plans online." Untreated lumber, chicken wire, keeps the pile contained but allows airflow. Smart. And you're turning it regularly, every few days. Keeps the temperature up and prevents anaerobic decomposition. Officer Morrison nodded appreciatively. "That's your key right there. Most people don't turn enough and wonder why their pile smells bad. You're doing it right." He pulled out a small notebook. "Mind if I ask you a few questions? Professional ones, I mean." "My wife and I just bought a house in Huntersville with a bigger yard, and I've been wanting to start composting again." We spent the next 15 minutes talking about compost management, while Patricia and Susan watched with increasing frustration from the fence line. I explained my layering system, how I kept a bin of shredded newspaper in the garage to add carbon material whenever I added fruit and vegetable scraps from the kitchen. Officer Morrison asked about pest management, and I told him about the chicken wire bottom I'd installed to keep rodents out, and how keeping meat, dairy, and oils out of the bin prevented most animal interest. "What about the steam?" he asked. "Is that always this visible?" "Only on cool mornings when there's a temperature differential. In summer, the pile still heats up, but you don't see the steam as much because the ambient air temperature is higher. It's the same principle as seeing your breath on a cold day." "Makes perfect sense." He jotted down a few notes. "And the end product, how long does it take?" "About 3 to 4 months for finished compost if I'm managing it actively. Could be 6 months if I was more passive about it. I usually know it's ready when it's dark brown, crumbly, and has that earthy smell. No recognizable pieces of the original materials." Patricia had apparently had enough. She marched over, her face flushed. "Officer, are you going to cite him or not? This is clearly a violation of community standards." Officer Morrison turned to her, his expression professional but cool. "Madam, there's no violation here. Composting is a legal and environmentally beneficial activity. The steam is a natural byproduct of the decomposition process and doesn't constitute a fire hazard, a safety risk, or any kind of code violation." "But the HOA bylaws, madam. I'm not here to enforce HOA bylaws. I'm here to assess potential fire hazards and threats to public safety. There are none. Mr. Vance is operating a well-maintained compost system that poses no risk to anyone." He turned back to me and handed me his card. "If you don't mind, could you email me some of those plans you mentioned, and maybe your source list for the chicken wire bottom design? I'd appreciate it." "Absolutely. Happy to help." Patricia's face had gone from red to nearly purple. "This is unacceptable. The board will hear about this." "The board can hear whatever you want to tell them, madam," Officer Morrison said calmly. "But calling 911 for a non-emergency like this ties up emergency resources. I'd suggest using the non-emergency line if you have future concerns, assuming those concerns are actually legitimate." He nodded to me, walked back to his cruiser, and drove off. Patricia stared at me like I'd personally offended her entire bloodline. "This isn't over, Richard. It's compost, Patricia. That's all it is." She stalked off with Susan in tow, and I headed inside to grab my things for work. I was already 20 minutes late for my meeting, but the encounter had been so absurd it was almost worth it. I'd expected to maybe get a citation I'd have to fight, or at worst, an order to remove the compost bin. Instead, I'd given gardening advice to a police officer and watched Patricia's complaint get dismissed entirely. I should have known it wouldn't end there. That evening, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. The return address was from Meadowbrook Heights HOA. Attention to Brenda Cunningham, HOA president. My stomach sank. Brenda was Patricia's closest friend and ally on the board, a 60-year-old retired real estate agent who ran the HOA like a personal fiefdom. Together, they'd made life miserable for dozens of residents over the years. I'd watched them force Mrs. Chen to remove her vegetable garden last year, claiming it violated the aesthetic standards of the community. They'd fined the Rodriguez family $2,000 for parking their work truck in their own driveway overnight. They'd even tried to ban children from playing basketball in their driveways because the sound was disruptive to community peace. I opened the letter inside my house. It was 3 pages long, printed on official HOA letterhead, and it made my blood pressure rise with every paragraph. The letter stated that I was in violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws, which prohibited unsightly structures and materials visible from neighboring properties. It claimed my compost bin was an eyesore that negatively impacted property values. It demanded I remove the structure within 14 days or face fines of $100 per day until compliance was achieved. It also stated I was being fined $500 for the emergency response incident that morning, claiming I had created a situation requiring police intervention. I read it 3 times, my anger building. The compost bin wasn't visible from the street. You'd have to deliberately look over my back fence to see it, which is exactly what Patricia had been doing. The emergency response incident was her fault, not mine, and the 14-day deadline was clearly designed to pressure me into immediate compliance without time to fight back properly. I pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws, a 70-page document I'd received when I bought the house. I'd read it once, found it excessive and controlling, and promptly filed it away. Now I went through it carefully, looking for Section 7, Paragraph 3. The actual text was vaguer than the letter suggested. It stated, "Residents shall maintain their properties in a manner consistent with community aesthetic standards. Structures and materials that create visual blight or reduce the property values of neighboring homes may be subject to review by the HOA board." The language was subjective and poorly defined. What constituted visual blight? Who determined impact on property values? And most importantly, the section mentioned review by the board, not immediate demands and fines. According to the bylaw's own procedures outlined in Section 12, any violation complaint had to be reviewed at a board meeting, with the accused homeowner given the opportunity to present their case before any penalties were imposed. They were skipping their own procedures. I spent the next hour researching North Carolina HOA law. I discovered that while HOAs had significant power, they weren't unlimited. They had to follow their own governing documents. They couldn't impose fines without proper notice and hearing procedures, and they couldn't charge residents for emergency services called by other residents. That last part was key. Patricia had called the police, not me. Charging me for her actions was almost certainly not enforceable. I also found something else interesting. North Carolina had passed a law in 2021 called the Right to Garden Act that prevented HOAs from completely prohibiting residents from growing vegetables and composting, though they could impose reasonable restrictions on location and appearance. My compost bin was in my back corner, barely visible even to my immediate neighbors. It was well constructed and maintained. By any reasonable standard, it shouldn't violate even restrictive HOA rules. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Timothy Brennan specialized in HOA disputes and had good reviews online. His office was in downtown Charlotte, in one of those historic buildings that had been converted into law offices. I took a long lunch break and drove down to meet with him. Timothy was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and an easy manner that put me at ease immediately. I explained the situation and showed him the letter and my copy of the bylaws. He read through everything carefully, making notes on a legal pad. They're overstepping badly. The procedural violations alone would probably get this dismissed, but the fine for the police call is especially problematic. You didn't call the police, didn't create an emergency situation, and didn't cause any actual harm. They can't charge you for another resident's actions. So what do I do? First, you write a response letter. We'll cite the procedural violations, dispute the fines, and demand a proper hearing under their own bylaws. Second, we'll mention the North Carolina Right to Garden Act. Third, we'll keep documentation of everything. Photos of your compost bin, copies of all correspondence, records of the police visit. If they push this, we'll push back harder. Will it be expensive? Might be. HOA disputes can get costly if they drag out. But honestly, most fold when they realize the homeowner is serious about fighting and has legal representation. They're used to people just complying because it's easier. When someone stands up, they often back down because they don't want the exposure or the legal fees either. He charged me $300 for the consultation and another $500 to draft a response letter. It hurt my wallet, but I was beyond caring. The principle mattered more than the money at this point. The response letter went out 2 days later, sent certified mail to the HOA board. It was professional but firm, laying out all the procedural violations, disputing every fine, citing the Right to Garden Act, and demanding a formal hearing. It also requested copies of any other complaints about my property and the documentation of how my compost bin allegedly impacted property values. I didn't hear anything for a week. Life went on. I went to work. I maintained my compost, and I ignored the pointed looks from Patricia whenever I saw her outside. Then, on a Friday evening, I got a phone call from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Vance, this is Brenda Cunningham, HOA president. I'm calling to inform you that your request for a hearing has been granted. The board will meet next Thursday at 7 p.m. at the community center. You'll have 10 minutes to present your case. Thank you. I'll be there. I should warn you, the board takes violations very seriously. We've had independent property assessments done that confirm your compost structure negatively impacts neighborhood aesthetics. I'd encourage you to consider compliance before the hearing to avoid additional penalties. I'll see you Thursday, Mrs. Cunningham." She hung up without another word. I immediately called Timothy Brennan and left a message about the hearing. He called back within an hour. "Good. They're following procedure now, probably because the letter scared them. I can attend with you if you want representation there. How much would that cost?" "Another $500 for the appearance. But Richard, I think you can handle this yourself if you're comfortable speaking in front of the board. Just stick to the facts, be professional, and don't let them intimidate you. They'll try. These boards often do, but you have a strong case." "I'll do it myself then. But can I call you if things go wrong?" "Absolutely. And email me after the hearing with what happened. If they rule against you, we'll discuss next steps. The week before the hearing dragged by. I prepared my presentation carefully, printing photos of my compost bin from multiple angles, researching property value data for the neighborhood, and preparing a short explanation of composting science. I even printed out the section of the Right to Garden Act that protected homeowner rights to maintain compost systems. Officer Dale Morrison had emailed me that Tuesday, thanking me again for the advice and saying he'd started his compost bin that weekend. His wife was excited about it, he said, and they were already collecting kitchen scraps. It was a small thing, but it reminded me why I was fighting this. Composting was good. It was beneficial. It reduced waste, created healthy soil, and connected people to natural cycles. The fact that Patricia saw steam and immediately jumped to calling the police said more about her mindset than anything else. Thursday evening came. The Meadowbrook Heights Community Center was a bland brick building near the subdivision entrance, used for HOA meetings and the occasional neighborhood event. I arrived 15 minutes early and found about 30 people already in the meeting room. Most were board members or regular attendees. I recognized several neighbors, including Patricia, who sat in the front row beside Brenda Cunningham. The board consisted of 5 members. Brenda, as president, sat in the center. Patricia was to her right. The other 3 were Howard Mitchell, a retired accountant who looked perpetually annoyed; Linda Shaw, a 50-something woman who ran a small catering business; and Marcus Green, the youngest board member at maybe 40, who worked in tech and always seemed uncomfortable at these meetings. Brenda called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. They went through standard business first: approval of last month's minutes, financial reports, updates on landscaping contracts. I sat in the back and waited. My case was listed as item 7 on the agenda, after discussions about pool maintenance and a proposal to repaint the neighborhood entrance sign. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Brenda finally called my name. Item 7. Violation complaint against Richard Vance, 4237 Willow Street. Mr. Vance, please come forward. I walked to the front of the room, my folder of materials in hand. 20 or 30 pairs of eyes watched me. Patricia's expression was smug. Brenda looked like she'd already made up her mind. You have 10 minutes to address the board regarding your violation, Brenda said. Please begin. I set up my photos on the table where everyone could see them. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm here because I received a violation notice regarding my compost bin. I'd like to explain why I believe this notice is inappropriate and should be withdrawn. First, let's talk about what composting is and why I'm doing it. Composting is the controlled decomposition of organic material into nutrient-rich soil amendment. It's environmentally beneficial because it diverts waste from landfills and creates a valuable resource for gardening. The EPA actively encourages home composting. North Carolina has specific laws protecting homeowners' rights to compost. I held up my printed copy of the Right to Garden Act. This law, passed in 2021, specifically prevents HOAs from prohibiting composting. While HOAs can impose reasonable restrictions on location and appearance, they cannot ban the practice entirely. Second, let's talk about my specific compost system. I built a 3-sided bin in the rear corner of my backyard, using untreated lumber and chicken wire. It's approximately 4 feet on each side, constructed neatly, and maintained regularly. Here are photos from multiple angles. I passed the photos to the board members. Marcus Green actually looked interested. The others examined them with varying degrees of attention. As you can see, The bin is not visible from the street. It's barely visible from neighboring properties unless someone is actively looking over my fence. It's clean, well-maintained, and produces no odors or pest problems. The steam that was reported is a natural byproduct of the decomposition process and indicates the system is working correctly. It poses no fire hazard, no safety risk, and no environmental concern. This was confirmed by Officer Dale Morrison of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department when he responded to a call about the bin. Patricia shifted in her seat but said nothing. Third, let's address the claimed impact on property values. The violation notice states that my compost bin creates visual blight and reduces neighboring property values. I'd like to see the evidence for this claim. What assessment was done? What methodology was used? What comparable sales data supports this conclusion? I looked directly at Brenda. In fact, research shows that sustainable landscaping practices, including composting, often increase property values by appealing to environmentally conscious buyers. I have studies here if the board would like to review them. Fourth, and finally, I'd like to address the procedural issues with the violation notice I received. According to Section 12 of our bylaws, any violation complaint must be reviewed by the board before penalties are imposed, and the accused homeowner must be given an opportunity for a hearing. The notice I received skipped this step entirely, demanding immediate compliance and imposing fines without due process. Additionally, I was charged $500 for an emergency response incident that I did not cause or request. Another resident called the police, not me, and charging me for her actions violates basic fairness. I gathered my materials. In summary, I'm asking the board to withdraw the violation notice, rescind all fines, and acknowledge my right to maintain a reasonable composting system on my property. Thank you for your time. I sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, then Brenda cleared her throat. Thank you, Mr. Vance. The board will now discuss the matter. What followed was 15 minutes of the most frustrating double talk I'd ever heard. Patricia immediately launched into a speech about how the community had standards to maintain, and how allowing one person to do whatever they wanted would lead to chaos. She claimed multiple neighbors had complained about the smell, though she couldn't name them. She insisted the steam was a fire hazard despite what the police officer had said. Howard Mitchell backed her up, saying that property values were indeed at risk, though he provided no actual evidence. He suggested that if I wanted to compost, I could do it somewhere less visible, perhaps in a sealed container in my garage. Linda Shaw was more measured. I have to say, the photos show a neat structure, and if the law protects composting, we need to be careful about how we proceed. I'm not convinced this is actually a violation. Marcus Green nodded. I agree with Linda. The structure looks fine to me, and if the police confirmed there's no safety hazard, I don't see the basis for action. We could be opening ourselves up to legal problems if we push this. We make the rules here, Brenda said firmly. The bylaws give us authority to maintain community standards. If we believe something violates those standards, we have the right to enforce compliance. But the North Carolina law supersedes our bylaws, Marcus pointed out. We can't enforce rules that violate state law. The argument went back and forth. I sat there, my frustration building as they debated my fate like I wasn't even in the room. Finally, Brenda called for a vote. All in favor of upholding the violation and requiring removal of the compost structure within 14 days. Patricia, Howard, and Brenda raised their hands. Opposed, Linda and Marcus raised theirs. The motion carries 3-2. Mr. Vance, you have 14 days to remove the compost bin. The fines will be reduced to $200 total as a courtesy for attending the hearing. You can pay at the HOA office or mail a check." I stood up. "This is a mistake. You're violating state law and your own procedures. I won't be removing the bin and I won't be paying any fines." "Then we'll file a lien against your property," Brenda said calmly, "and we'll pursue legal action if necessary. This meeting is adjourned." I walked out of the community center, my hands shaking with anger. Several neighbors stopped me outside to express support. One older gentleman, Frank, who lived 3 streets over, said he'd been fighting the HOA for years over various petty issues and admired my stand. A younger couple, the Andersons, said they thought the whole thing was ridiculous and offered to testify on my behalf if needed. But support didn't change the immediate situation. I was now in open defiance of the HOA board, and they had legal tools to make my life difficult. I called Timothy Brennan the next morning and explained what had happened. "Okay," he said calmly. "They're making this worse for themselves. The fact that they voted against state law is actually good for us. It shows they're acting arbitrarily. Here's what we do next. I'll file a complaint in district court challenging their decision. We'll argue that they're violating the Right to Garden Act and their own procedural requirements. We'll also request an injunction preventing them from imposing fines or liens while the case is pending." "How long will this take?" "Months, probably. Maybe as long as a year before we get a final resolution, but the injunction should protect you in the meantime. It'll cost more money, though. We're probably looking at $3,000 to $5,000 in legal fees by the time this is done." I thought about my savings account. It would hurt, but I could afford it. "Do it. I'm not backing down." "Good man. I'll start drafting the complaint today." The legal process moved slowly. Timothy filed our complaint in late October. The court granted a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from taking action against me while the case proceeded. The HOA hired their own lawyer, a firm that specialized in defending homeowner associations. They filed a response denying all our claims and insisting they had the right to enforce their aesthetic standards. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood became tense. Patricia made a point of glaring at me whenever our paths crossed. Someone left an anonymous note on my door saying I was ruining the neighborhood. Another note called me selfish for not respecting community rules. I suspected Patricia was behind them, but I couldn't prove it. On the other hand, I also received messages of support. Frank stopped by with a 6-pack of beer, and we spent an evening on my back deck talking about his own battles with the HOA. The Andersons brought over a lasagna and said they were tired of the board's overreach. Even Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who'd been forced to remove her vegetable garden, came by to thank me for fighting back. She'd been too intimidated to resist, she said, and she regretted it. In November, something interesting happened. Marcus Green resigned from the HOA board. He sent an email to all residents explaining that he disagreed with the board's direction and couldn't in good conscience continue serving. He specifically mentioned the composting dispute as an example of the board overstepping reasonable bounds. His resignation triggered a special election to fill his seat. Several people encouraged me to run, but I declined. I was already too deep in the conflict. Instead, a woman named Rachel Peters ran on a platform of more reasonable HOA governance. She was a teacher, a mother of 2, and she was fed up with the board's petness. She won the election easily, but Rachel's presence didn't change the immediate board dynamics. Brenda, Patricia, Howard, and Linda still had the votes to do whatever they wanted. And what they wanted, apparently, was to make an example of me. In December, Despite the court's temporary restraining order, they filed a lien against my property for unpaid fines, totaling $800. The lien was improper and violated the court order, but it still went on the public record, which could affect my credit and my ability to refinance my mortgage. Timothy Brennan was furious when I told him. They're in contempt of court. We can file a motion to have that lien removed and possibly get sanctions against them. Do it. The contempt hearing was scheduled for January, nearly 4 months after the original board meeting. I had to take a day off work to attend. The hearing was in the Mecklenburg County Courthouse downtown, in a small courtroom before Judge Rebecca Winters. Timothy presented our case efficiently. The HOA had filed a lien despite a clear court order preventing any enforcement action. Their lawyer, a slick man named Gerald Pritchard, argued that the lien was filed before they received notice of the restraining order, though the dates on the documents clearly contradicted this. Judge Winters was not impressed. Mr. Pritchard, the restraining order was issued on October 28th. Your clients filed this lien on December 3rd. Are you seriously arguing they weren't aware of the court order? Your Honor, there may have been a communication delay. There may have been a deliberate attempt to circumvent this court's authority. The lien is hereby voided, and the HOA is ordered to file the necessary paperwork to remove it from public record within 5 business days. Additionally, I'm imposing sanctions of $1,000 payable to Mr. Vance for the legal fees incurred addressing this contempt. It was a satisfying moment, but it also escalated the conflict. The HOA was now out $1,000 plus their own legal fees. Brenda and Patricia weren't going to let this go. The main case hearing was scheduled for March. As spring approached, my compost bin continued doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I'd added fall leaves, kitchen scraps, and garden waste all winter. The pile had cooled during the cold months, but started heating up again as temperatures rose. I harvested my first finished compost in February, a rich, dark material that I spread on my garden beds. My tomato plants that spring were going to be incredible. Officer Morrison had stayed in touch via email. His compost system was doing well, he reported, and he'd even built a second bin to rotate material. He asked if I'd mind him stopping by sometime to see my setup in person, and I agreed. He came by on a Saturday in late February with his wife, Karen, who was just as interested in gardening as he was. We spent an hour in my backyard discussing compost management, garden planning, and pest control. Karen took notes and photos. Dale told me the police department had been getting a lot of calls from my neighborhood lately, mostly from Patricia about various supposed violations by different residents. The department was getting tired of it, he said. At some point, frequent false reports could constitute misuse of emergency services. Has she called about me again? I asked. Twice. Once about your garbage cans being visible from the street, which isn't a police matter. Once about a supposed property line dispute with another neighbor, which also isn't our jurisdiction. We've started logging her calls in case they become a pattern. That was interesting information. Patricia was making enemies beyond just me. The court hearing in March was the culmination of everything. Timothy and I arrived early and went over our presentation one last time. The HOA's lawyer was already there, along with Brenda and Patricia. They sat on one side of the courtroom, we sat on the other, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Winters took the bench and reviewed the case file. This is a dispute over a compost bin. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Timothy said. Mr. Vance maintains a composting system on his property in compliance with North Carolina law. The HOA is attempting to force him to remove it based on aesthetic concerns that are both subjective and contradicted by state statute. Gerald Pritchard stood. Your Honor, this is about property values and community standards. Homeowner associations exist to maintain the character of neighborhoods. The bylaws give the board authority to enforce reasonable restrictions on structures and activities that affect other residents. Mr. Vance's compost bin is unsightly and has generated multiple complaints. Let's see some evidence, Judge Winters said. Mr. Brennan, please present your case. Timothy did an excellent job. He walked through the timeline of events, showed photos of my compost bin from multiple angles, cited the Right to Garden Act, and demonstrated the procedural violations in how the HOA had handled the complaint. He called me as a witness, and I explained the composting process, the benefits, and the lack of any negative impact on neighbors. Has anyone actually complained directly to you? Judge Winters asked me. No, Your Honor. Not a single neighbor has approached me with concerns. The only person who's expressed opposition is Patricia Henderson, the HOA vice president, and the police officer who responded to the initial call. What did he say? He confirmed there was no fire hazard, no safety risk, and no violation of any code or law. He actually asked me for advice on starting his own composting system. That got a slight smile from the judge. Gerald Pritchard presented the HOA's case next. He called Brenda as a witness, and she testified about the importance of maintaining property values and aesthetic standards. She claimed the compost bin was visible from neighboring properties and created an eyesore. You have any evidence that property values have actually been affected? Judge Winters asked. We had an assessment done. You have documentation of that assessment. A written report from a certified appraiser. Brenda hesitated. We had verbal consultations with real estate professionals. So no written documentation. And can you name these professionals? I'd have to check our records. It went downhill from there for the HOA. Patricia testified next, and she was worse. She became emotional, insisting the compost bin was a threat to the neighborhood and that I was deliberately defying community standards. When Timothy Cross examined her, he got her to admit she'd never actually spoken to me about any concerns before calling the police. He also got her to acknowledge she'd called the police multiple times about various neighbors over the past year. How many times would you estimate? Timothy asked. I don't keep count. I call when there are violations. More than 10 times, possibly. More than 20. I don't know. I'm trying to protect our community. Timothy let that hang in the air for a moment before sitting down. Judge Winters took a brief recess to review the materials, then returned with her decision. I've reviewed the evidence, the relevant statutes, and the HOA governing documents. Here are my findings. First, the North Carolina Right to Garden Act clearly protects homeowners' rights to engage in composting. While HOAs can impose reasonable restrictions on location and appearance, they cannot prohibit the practice entirely. Second, Mr. Vance's composting system is reasonable by any objective standard. It's located in a rear corner of his property. It's well constructed and maintained, and it produces no documented nuisance to neighbors. Third, the HOA failed to follow its own procedural requirements before imposing penalties. Fourth, there's no credible evidence that the compost bin has negatively affected property values. Therefore, I find in favor of Mr. Vance. The violation notice is hereby voided. All fines are canceled, and the HOA is prohibited from taking any action against Mr. Vance regarding his composting system. Additionally, the HOA is ordered to pay Mr. Vance's legal fees, which I'm setting at $4,000 based on the documentation provided. The HOA is also ordered to revise their bylaws within 60 days to bring them into compliance with the Right to Garden Act. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. Brenda's face was stone. I felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost dizzying. Furthermore, Judge Winters continued, I'm concerned about the pattern of behavior demonstrated by the HOA board in this case. The contempt of court regarding the improper lien, the procedural violations, and what appears to be targeted harassment of a homeowner for engaging in lawful activity all suggest a board that has lost sight of its proper role. I'm ordering the HOA to provide training for all board members on their legal obligations and limitations. If this court sees similar cases from this HOA in the future, sanctions will be more severe. She banged her gavel. This case is closed. We stood as she left the bench. Timothy shook my hand. That's as complete a victory as we could have hoped for. Congratulations. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months, but the story didn't end there. What happened over the next few weeks was even more interesting than the court case. First, the HOA paid my legal fees as ordered. $4,000 appeared in my bank account via wire transfer within the required time frame. It didn't cover all my costs, but it helped significantly. Second, word spread through the neighborhood about the court decision. I suddenly became something of a folk hero to residents who'd been intimidated by the board for years. People stopped me on walks to thank me. I received cards and emails of support. Frank organized a neighborhood barbecue and invited everyone except the board members. About 40 people showed up, and we spent an evening sharing stories about HOA overreach and discussing ways to reform the governance of our community. Third, and most dramatically, residents started organizing for the next board election. Under the HOA bylaws, all 5 board positions were up for election every 2 years, and the next election was scheduled for May. A group of neighbors formed a slate of candidates committed to reasonable governance and common sense rules. Rachel Peters, who'd won the special election to replace Marcus Green, was part of it. So were Frank, the Andersons, and 2 other long-time residents fed up with the current board. Brenda, Patricia, and Howard announced they'd run for re-election. Linda Shaw decided not to run, saying she was tired of the conflict. The campaign was intense. The reform slate held meetings at people's houses, sent emails to all residents, and created a website outlining their platform. They promised to end petty enforcement, focus on genuine community needs like infrastructure maintenance, and respect homeowners' rights. They specifically pledged to support sustainable practices like composting and vegetable gardens. The existing board members sent their own emails warning about declining standards and property values if the radicals took over. Patricia went door-to-door campaigning, though several people told me they shut their doors in her face. I didn't run for the board myself, but I supported the reform slate actively. I hosted one of the community meetings and spoke about my experience. I also did something that turned out to be important. I filed a formal complaint with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department about Patricia's repeated non-emergency calls. Officer Morrison helped me with this. He explained that while any individual call might not be actionable, a pattern of misuse of emergency resources could be addressed. The department had been documenting Patricia's calls, and there were indeed more than 20 over the past 18 months. Most were about minor issues that weren't police matters at all. The complaint triggered an investigation by the department's Community Relations Division. In April, Patricia received a formal warning letter stating that further misuse of 911 could result in criminal charges under North Carolina General Statute 14111.4, which prohibited making false reports to law enforcement. The letter was copied to the HOA board. That warning letter changed the dynamics of the election. Several residents who'd been on the fence about the reform slate were pushed over by the revelation that Patricia had been warned by police. Even people who didn't care much about composting or gardens cared about someone abusing emergency services. The election was held in mid-May at the community center. I arrived early and found the parking lot already full. Over 100 residents showed up to vote, far more than the typical turnout of 20 or 30. When the votes were counted that evening, the results were decisive. All 5 reform slate candidates won. Rachel Peters became the new board president. Frank was vice president. The Andersons and the other 2 candidates rounded out the board. Brenda, Patricia, and Howard were all voted out. Patricia left the community center in tears. Brenda looked shell-shocked. Howard just looked angry. The new board held its first meeting 2 weeks later. I attended, along with about 50 other residents curious to see how things would change. The difference in tone was immediately apparent. Rachel ran the meeting efficiently but collaboratively. They discussed actual community needs: repairing the entrance sign, upgrading the pool equipment, organizing a neighborhood cleanup day. When they got to bylaw revisions, Rachel presented a draft that had been prepared by an attorney to comply with the court's order. The new provisions specifically protected residents' rights to compost, grow vegetables, and engage in sustainable landscaping practices. They set clear, objective standards for what constituted legitimate violations versus personal aesthetic preferences. They established better procedures for handling complaints, including a requirement that board members attempt to resolve issues informally before imposing penalties. They also created an appeals process that didn't require residents to hire lawyers. The board voted unanimously to adopt the revisions. Several residents in the audience applauded. Life in Meadowbrook Heights improved dramatically over the following months. The new board focused on genuine maintenance issues. They negotiated better contracts for landscaping and pool services, saving the HOA money. They organized community events that brought people together rather than driving them apart. And they stopped the endless petty enforcement that had made so many residents miserable. Mrs. Chen planted a new vegetable garden that spring. She brought me tomatoes and cucumbers all summer as thanks for fighting the battle she'd been too afraid to fight. The Rodriguez family started parking their work truck in their driveway again without fear of fines. Kids played basketball and rode bikes freely. I expanded my composting operation, adding a second bin to rotate material more efficiently. I started a small vegetable garden using the compost I'd created, growing tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and herbs. Neighbors started asking me for advice, and I found myself becoming an informal resource for people interested in sustainable gardening. Officer Dale Morrison stopped by several times throughout the summer to check on my garden and share updates on his own. His composting system was thriving, and he'd gotten several other officers interested. They were joking about starting a police garden club. He told me the department was pleased with how the Patricia situation had been resolved. She hadn't called 911 inappropriately since receiving the warning letter, and the neighborhood's call volume had dropped significantly. In August, I ran into Patricia at the grocery store. It was the first time I'd seen her since the election. She was alone, looked tired, and seemed to be trying to avoid me. I almost let her go, but something made me approach her. "Patricia." She turned, her expression guarded. "Richard, I just wanted to say I hope there are no hard feelings. I know things got intense." She stared at me for a long moment. "You cost me my position on the board. You humiliated me in court. You got me investigated by the police. You called the police on my compost bin. You tried to fine me for doing something environmentally beneficial and completely legal. You and Brenda tried to bully me into compliance instead of having a reasonable conversation. I was trying to protect the neighborhood. From what? From steam. From me growing better tomatoes." She didn't have an answer for that. After a moment, she turned and walked away. I watched her go and felt something unexpected: pity. She'd been so caught up in control and rules and standards that she'd forgotten what community actually meant. She'd turned herself into the neighborhood villain over a compost bin. I never saw her at neighborhood events after that. I heard from Frank that she and her husband were considering moving, that she couldn't handle the loss of status and influence. I didn't know if that was true, but I understood the feeling. She defined herself by that board position, and without it, she was lost. As fall approached and the weather cooled, my compost bins steamed on cool mornings just like they had a year ago. But this time, nobody called the police. Instead, neighbors stopped to ask questions. How hot did the pile get? What could they compost? Did I have any extra finished compost they could use in their gardens? I gave workshops at the community center, teaching basic composting techniques to anyone interested. About 20 people attended the first one. We covered the fundamentals: carbon to nitrogen ratios, moisture levels, turning schedules, troubleshooting common problems. People took notes and photos. They asked good questions. The new board even discussed creating a community composting program where residents could drop off yard waste and kitchen scraps at a central location. In October, Judge Winter's office sent me a letter. It was brief and formal, but it made me smile. The court had received confirmation that the Meadowbrook Heights HOA had completed the required board training and bylaw revisions. The case was officially closed. Attached was a note from the judge's clerk saying Her Honor wanted me to know she'd received several letters from other homeowners thanking her for the decision and explaining how it had improved life in the neighborhood. That same week, I harvested my fall garden. The tomatoes grown in compost amended soil had been incredible, producing twice what I'd gotten from store-bought plants in previous years. I shared the bounty with neighbors, dropping off bags of tomatoes, peppers, and zucchini to anyone who wanted them. Mrs. Chen and I traded vegetables, comparing notes on growing techniques and planning for next year. In November, a reporter from a local Charlotte newspaper contacted me. She was writing a story about HOA conflicts and had heard about my case. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to reignite old tensions, but she convinced me that the story could help other homeowners facing similar situations. She interviewed me, Timothy Brennan, Officer Morrison, and several of my neighbors. She even tried to interview Brenda and Patricia, but both declined. The article ran in early December under the headline, "How a Compost Bin Changed a Neighborhood." It was fair and well-written, explaining the legal issues without sensationalizing the conflict. It quoted Judge Winter's decision extensively and highlighted the successful board election that followed. It positioned my case as an example of homeowners standing up to overreaching HOAs and the positive changes that could result. The article got picked up by several other outlets. I received emails from people across North Carolina and even from other states, asking for advice on fighting their own HOA battles. Some were about composting and gardens. Others were about solar panels, clotheslines, vegetable gardens, or other sustainable practices being restricted by their associations. I tried to respond to everyone, offering encouragement and referring them to the Right to Garden Act and similar laws in their states. Timothy Brennan told me he'd received several new clients as a result of the article, homeowners who wanted help challenging unreasonable HOA restrictions. He joked that I'd become his best advertisement. By the end of that year, my life had settled into a comfortable routine. I went to work, maintained my garden and compost, and enjoyed living in a neighborhood that finally felt like a real community. The new board was doing excellent work. Property values were actually rising, not because of rigid enforcement of aesthetic rules, but because people wanted to live in a place where neighbors supported each other and common sense prevailed. I added a third compost bin in January, creating a full rotation system where one bin was actively receiving new material, one was cooking, and one was curing finished compost. I started vermicomposting indoors as well, using red wiggler worms to process kitchen scraps year-round. My garden plans for the new year were ambitious. Raised beds, a small greenhouse, maybe even a few fruit trees. Officer Morrison and his wife came by in February to see my expanded setup. They've become friends over the past year and a half, united by our shared interest in gardening. Dale had lost 20 pounds working in his garden, he told me. Karen had taken up canning and preserving. They were planning to install solar panels on their house, inspired by my fight to do something sustainable despite opposition. You know what the funny thing is? Dale said as we stood in my backyard, watching steam rise from the active compost bin on that cool February morning. When Patricia called us that first time, I thought it would be just another nuisance call, some neighbor dispute over nothing, but it turned into something bigger. It changed the whole neighborhood. It even changed me. I'm healthier, happier, more connected to where my food comes from, all because she called the police over steam from a compost bin. Sometimes the small things matter, I said. Sometimes standing up for something as simple as the right to turn vegetable scraps into soil can change everything. Karen took a photo of the steaming compost bin. This should be in a gardening magazine, the compost bin that launched a revolution. We all laughed, but there was truth in it. That compost bin had become a symbol, not just in my neighborhood, but to everyone who'd followed the story. It represented the right to live sustainably, to resist arbitrary authority, and to build community based on mutual respect rather than rigid control. As winter turned to spring once again, I looked forward to another growing season. My garden would be bigger and better than ever, nourished by the rich compost I'd created from what others would have thrown away. My neighborhood would continue healing and growing, learning to be a real community rather than just a collection of houses governed by petty rules. And somewhere in the morning mist, on cool days when conditions were just right, steam would rise from my compost bins. Not a fire hazard. Not a violation. Not a problem at all. Just the visible sign of life, growth, and transformation. Just nature doing what nature does best, taking what was discarded and turning it into something valuable. Patricia never did call the police again. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband moved to a condo community the following summer, somewhere with no yard maintenance and no board positions to fill. I never saw her again. I didn't wish her ill. I just hoped she found peace somewhere, somehow, and learned that control and community are two different things. The last I heard, the Meadowbrook Heights HOA was being cited as a model for reasonable governance by the Community Associations Institute. The new board had been invited to speak at conferences about their approach. Other neighborhoods were adopting similar reforms, updating their bylaws to protect homeowners' rights while still maintaining genuine community standards. And it all started because someone saw steam rising from a compost bin and decided it was a problem worth calling the police over. Because an officer showed up and asked about carbon to nitrogen ratios instead of just writing a citation. Because I decided that my right to turn kitchen scraps into garden soil was worth fighting for. Sometimes the most important battles are fought over the smallest things. Sometimes changing a neighborhood, or even changing the world a little bit, starts with nothing more than standing your ground and insisting that what you're doing is right, even when people with power and authority tell you it's wrong. My compost bins still steam on cool mornings. My garden still grows. My neighbors still stop by to ask questions and share vegetables. And life in Meadowbrook Heights is better than it's ever been, all because we learned that community isn't about enforcing conformity. It's about respecting each other's right to live well, sustainably, and freely, as long as we're not actually harming anyone. The compost bin stands in my backyard still, 3 bins now instead of 1, a testament to the power of standing up for what's right. Every time I turn the pile, every time I harvest the finished compost, every time I use it to nourish my garden and grow food, I remember the journey it took to get here. The threatening letters, the board meetings, the court hearings, the election, and finally, the victory. And every time steam rises on a cool morning, I smile. Because that steam isn't a violation or a problem. It's proof that life goes on, that organic matter breaks down and becomes something new, that even in the face of opposition and difficulty, good things can grow. That's what composting teaches you in the end. Nothing is ever wasted. Everything can be transformed. Even conflicts and struggles can break down over time and become the rich soil from which community grows. That's the real story of the compost bin that changed everything. Not just my story, but the story of everyone in Meadowbrook Heights who learned to see things differently, to question authority when it overreaches, and to build something better together. We took something that could have been bitter and divisive and transformed it into something nourishing and life-giving, just like compost.